Welcome to ATF, After the Fire, a line of duty death podcast brought to you by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation in collaboration with firefighterskills.com. I'm your host, John Nelson. After the Fire is a post-line of duty death incident podcast. Our goal is to reduce the number of preventable fireground fatalities by learning from the unintended outcomes of line of duty deaths. The ATF podcast is dedicated to the remembrance of fallen firefighters and the comprehensive review of their line of duty deaths and near misses. We will intimately relive experiences through interviews of the boots on the ground and the subject matter experts connected to the incident. Episode 1 is dedicated to the 13 firefighters that lost their lives at the 1941 Strand theater fire in Brockton, Massachusetts. But first, we will begin by outlining some of the 16 firefighter life safety initiatives from the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. Presenting the firefighter life safety initiatives that are relevant to today's podcast is the Director of Fire Service Programs at the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, Chief John Tippett. Chief Tippett has a career-long interest in firefighter safety. He served 33 years with the Montgomery County, Maryland Fire Department, and he then went on to work for Charleston, South Carolina as part of that department's recovery from the tragic Sofa Superstore fire of 2007. Chief, welcome to After the Fire.
Thanks, John. It's a real pleasure to be here, and the Foundation is very happy to be working with firefighterskills.com with this podcast. The relevant firefighter life safety initiatives we'll be talking about today are number 1, cultural change, number 3, risk management, number 4, empowerment, and number 9, fatality and near-miss investigations. Our goal is to share the lessons learned from these events and help prevent firefighter line of duty deaths in the future.
Thank you, Chief. The Strand theater fire of 1941. What is the point of discussing a 78-year-old fire today?
Well, I think as we've learned through history of not just the fire service, but history in general, if we don't learn from the past, we will repeat the events that happened. So this fire in particular remains within the top 10 of firefighter line of duty death events in the course of an American fire service experience. And we thought that it would be a great first effort to remember the sacrifice of the 13 Brockton firefighters who died in 1941.
Yeah, before you got started today, you mentioned that we needed to target fires that have been lost throughout history, bring them back and learn their lessons. I think that's a great idea. Chief, line of duty death reports haven't been around very long. When was the first line of duty death report made public?
Some departments through their history would do investigations of events, and the lessons would be published just within the fire department. It wasn't until the 1970s or so that line of duty death events started to go, or the reports that came out of those events started to go beyond the doors or the walls of the fire department where the event occurred. So it's been within a generation of fire service, the last generation of fire service firefighters, that we've started to share those events, not been so closed-minded. The Phoenix Fire Department was probably at the forefront with their efforts to share events that happened with events that occurred in Phoenix.
Yeah, it's so important for folks involved in line of duty deaths and near misses to share their experiences. We hope this podcast can facilitate that need. What efforts have been made to encourage firefighters to come forward and share their stories?
There's been a couple of efforts that are out there, and there's actually been a shift in accident investigation in industry in general, especially high-risk events. And one of the things that we're looking at is a concept called learning from unintended outcomes. And that's a U.S. Forest Service program that's sort of revolutionized how we look at events. So rather than take the incident itself and then overlay the SOPs or SOGs that are in place, we try to get to the individuals that are actively or were actively involved in the incident that occurred and find out what was going on in their minds at the time that the event occurs. What is it that made them deviate from policy? Why did they decide to take the actions that they took? And look at this through the prism of non-punitive action and really try to drill down into what was going on in their mind that led up to the event. The unfortunate part is when a tragedy occurs, if it's an individual tragedy, we can't talk to that person. But very rarely in our field is there just one person that was part of an event that leads to a line of duty death. And we do have the benefit of being able to talk to witnesses, other participants, people that were part of the call.
Yeah, and isn't the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation also pushing for the involvement of incident commanders in line of duty deaths that they've experienced?
Yes, we just recently created a new program called IC to IC, and that's a program that's designed to help and assist incident commanders that experience a line of duty death. So we're currently developing programs to reach out to those incident commanders. We brought together a cohort of 22 incident commanders that had experienced a line of duty death. And that from that core group, we're creating learning experiences, preparing incident commanders for the line of duty death event. We hope it never happens to them, but each of the individuals in this group can tell you they thought it was never going to happen to them either. And we want to make sure that we better prepare incident commanders for some of those circumstances.
What an outstanding program. If any of you listeners out there want more information about the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation and what they do, please visit www.firehero.org. Chief Tippett, thank you and the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation for helping firefighterskills.com make the After the Fire podcast happen. We couldn't have done it without you. We look forward to working with you on the many episodes to come.
John, we're very pleased with our collaboration with firefighterskills.com, and we're happy to support the effort.
It was a pleasure having you on ATF today, Chief. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks. Pleasure.
All right, let's introduce our guest panel today. First, retired Brockton Fire Chief Kenneth Galligan. Chief Galligan worked at Brockton Fire Department from 1968 until 2010. He's a member of the Brockton Historical Society, the curator of the Brockton Fire Museum, an instructor at the Massachusetts Firefighter Academy, and the operations chief of the Massachusetts Department of Fire Services Incident Support and Rehab Units. Chief, welcome to After the Fire.
Good afternoon.
We also have joining us today author and historian Nicole Casper. Nicole has served as the Director of Archives and Historical Collections at Stonehill College since 2001. She's also the co-author of 2 books with the late James Benson, The Strand Theater Fire and The Brockton Tragedy at Moosehead Lake. Nicole's been working with the Brockton Historical Society since the mid-2000s and currently serves as the Society's president. Nicole, welcome to After the Fire.
Thank you.
And finally, we have retired Brockton Fire Department Captain Joseph Lakacher. Captain Lakacher worked at the Brockton Fire Department from 1973 until 2003. Captain Lakacher experienced a near miss. And Captain, what year was that?
1977.
So you weren't too long with the department when that happened.
No.
Sir, ATF thanks you for coming by today and sharing your story. Nicole, we'll start with you. Your book, The Strand Theater Fire, is absolutely amazing. It gives us quite the in-depth look at the historical events that led to and transpired on March 10, 1941 in downtown Brockton. You unearthed so much, even the fact that this place was once partially owned by famed bare-knuckle pugilist John L. Sullivan. Let's begin with a little historical background on this bakery-turned-theater.
Well, the Strand Theater was actually originally the Empire Theater, built in the early 1900s. It suffered a fire itself as the Empire in 1915 and was rebuilt and renamed the Strand. In the 1930s, the Strand Theater was renovated, and in 1941, tragically, a fire broke out just after midnight on March 10, 1941, and as a result of the fire and the collapse of the ceiling, 13 firefighters lost their lives.
Yeah, a routine fire in the cellar turned into 13 firefighters dead and more than 20 injured. As Chief Tippett pointed out earlier, it's still one of the top 10 deadliest firefighter disasters in U.S. history. Let's dive into that tragic day, March 10th, 1941. You depicted it as a cold, wet, rainy night. Please talk to us about how that fire was discovered and some of the more intimate details about the scene.
Saturday night, it was a normal Saturday night with shows playing. After the last show, they were cleaning up just after midnight. The fire was discovered in the basement. They went to firebox 1311.
Well, before we get into that, I wanted to bring up what Chief Galligan had said before the podcast about moviegoers that evening saying they smelled smoke. Chief, would you mind elaborating a little on that, please?
Yeah, we were listening to the interview with retired Chief Burrell, who was the last surviving member of the Brockton Fire Department of that fire. He has since passed away. And he mentioned in his discourse that several of the people that were in the theater mentioned later, of course, that they had smelled smoke. And it never really became a factor that was immediately out there. The immediate factor was that the fire department discovered the fire in the cellar. So it would appear that the fire had been burning for some time. And if it is true that some of the moviegoers actually did smell some smoke, it would kind of reinforce that theory that the fire was burning for a while.
If anyone listening wants to check out that interview with Edward Burrell that Chief's talking about, go to youtube.com and type in Brockton's Strand Theater Fire Disaster Recalled, which is posted by Enterprise News. It's an eyewitness account from the last surviving firefighter of the 1941 Strand Theater fire. Truly priceless stuff. Is there any record as to how long after the moviegoers had left that the fire was discovered?
We don't have the times that the theater ran the shows that night. The only reason we know the names of the shows was just because we have this wonderful picture of the marquee. But I would assume that they finished around, between 10:30 and 11:30.
So that fire was churning.
Probably been smoldering for at least an hour or so before it was discovered.
So the custodian, Christopher Moore, discovered the fire in the basement while he was cleaning, and then he told his assistant, Roger Thunnert, to go sound the alarm. Number 1311, as you were saying earlier.
So box 1311 was struck, and the fire apparatus, the first responders came from that. They threw cellar pipes, thought they had it within several minutes. A second alarm was struck. And from there, firefighters responded. The fire department was fairly small at that time. So when the second alarm was struck, that was when the off-duty firefighters began to be called.
Yeah, that's actually an amazing fact I wanted to touch on to set the stage out there for everyone listening. At the time of the fire, Brockton employed 143 paid firefighters staffing 6 fire stations with 5 engines and hose wagons, 3 ladder companies, and a special operations squad known as Squad A. Now, these firefighters were on 84-hour work weeks, which is basically 24 hours on, 24 hours off, with the 12 hours on, 12 hours off thrown in there for rest, I guess. Not only that, but these men were expected to show up from off-duty if alarms were sounded. So in other words, if a second alarm or a general alarm was struck and you were off-duty, you were expected to be there. Before moving on with the story, I think we need to take a moment to give credit to Connie Lyons. He's the Brockton Enterprise night reporter responsible for so much of the first-line history of this event. Nicole?
So Connie Lyons was a reporter for the local newspaper, the Brockton Daily Enterprise. And to give a little bit of history, the Strand Theater was located right next to the Brockton Police Station. Within feet of the Brockton Police Station and within feet of Brockton City Hall. And he was sitting in the police station, probably most likely waiting for somebody to be brought in on charges. And he was the night reporter. And this quote from the book, I was talking to Mrs. Ellis Devine, police matron, when the first alarm sounded. Jumping into the police ambulance with house officers, I went to the fire scene. We find that very interesting because, again, he was only feet from the fire scene.
Yeah.
Upon entering the theater, I observed the firemen under Deputy Chief Murphy chopping a hole in the flooring on the left side of the main entrance to the matinee floor. Once the flames broke through, the smoke filtered through the theater to such an extent that Deputy Chief Murphy sounded a second alarm. So from this quote and from what we know of the fire, we think that there was some delay before he got there because obviously he didn't hear about the fire as the alarm was struck. Obviously, the firefighters had already gotten there. But he was there and was able to kind of chronicle the actual fire. Second alarm was sounded at 12:44. First alarm was at 12:38. So they knew they had a fire going.
You know, that's a surprisingly good response time considering how alarms were transmitted back then. Chief Galligan took us on an amazing tour of the Brockton Fire Museum and demonstrated how those firefighters would have received such an alarm. We're posting a video of that on our website for you listeners to check out. Chief, tell us about the inner workings and efficiency of Brockton's multilinguistic call box system.
Well, we still have a telegraph fire alarm system in the city with over 500 boxes in the system. And we generally refer to that system as our multilinguistic call box system because anyone that needs assistance from the fire department, you can simply pull the hook and a fire truck will respond to whatever your emergency is. And in today's society where there's a lot of linguistic problems in the city, even if you don't speak English, you can still call for help. And that's kind of where that term came from. So the box 1311 was the box that was pulled by the night custodian, and that was the first notification that the fire department had of the fire. And that box being downtown was known as a 3-engine company box because it's a high-value district with a lot of big buildings. The first alarm assignment was 3 engine companies, a ladder company, the squad company, and the deputy acting as the incident commander.
The first alarm was pulled at 12:38, the second at 12:44. Again, that response time is remarkably quick. How close were the responders to the Strand Theater?
Well, the headquarters station is located on Pleasant Street, which is only several blocks from the theater, and the response time from Station 1, the headquarters station, to this theater was probably not much more than a minute. And there were 3 stations that were responding, which would be the headquarters station on Pleasant Street, Engine Company 4 from Crescent Street, which was probably 3/4 of a mile from this theater, and Engine Company 5 from the West Side Station, and that's probably another 3/4 of a mile. So it was a very fast response. And the fact that 6 minutes after the box was pulled would indicate to me that the deputy chief realized right away that he had a fire that was larger than what could be handled by those companies that were coming in on the first alarm.
Nicole, please talk about the report of Deputy Chief Murphy. For the reading and listening audience, it paints quite the picture of what this scene may have looked like.
So Deputy Chief Murphy gave an interview to the Enterprise about a day or two after the fire and described the scene as follows. When we went down, we laid a line from the hydrant in the front of the main entrance. As soon as we got in there, we threw down 3 to 4 cellar pipes. A cellar pipe is an appliance for shooting water to all parts of the compartment under a floor or ceiling. They threw the cellar pipes. They killed the fire in the cellar in that particular spot, but they knew the fire was working up the south and west walls. The lines were taken to the first balcony, which was the mezzanine level, by the men of the first platoon, which included Henry Sullivan, Dennis Murphy, Martin Lipper, and George Collin.
And this is about the time that Chief Murphy struck that second alarm. Nicole, you and Chief have been kind enough to provide to us bird's eye view maps of the areas of downtown Brockton that we've been discussing today. We're going to put those up on the website as well for anyone wanting more visual information. Chief, please explain to us south and west in relation to the main entrance of the theater and the location of the matinee area where the crews were working.
Well, the main entrance to the theater was off of School Street. So that would be on the south side of School Street. And when you walked in that entranceway, you probably walked 50 or 60 feet into the main portion of the theater. The back of the theater was where the walkway was that took you down to the main floor and also to the 2 stairways that went upstairs. There was a candy counter there that's referenced numerous times in the investigation. So it was almost shaped like an L. When you walked in the entranceway from School Street and you reached the back of the lobby, you would then turn left into the main auditorium, so that when you were sitting in your seat, you were looking in an easterly direction, which would be looking towards City Hall.
And again, we will be putting maps and photos and videos of everything Chief's talking about on the website to accompany this episode and give you more information. Nicole, another unsung hero in your book is Stanley Bowman, photographer for the Brockton Enterprise. Talk to us about the photos he took at the Strand that night.
So Stanley Bowman is kind of legendary in the city of Brockton, and Stonehill is actually lucky enough to have his entire photograph collection. Stanley was a photographer for the Brockton Enterprise, and he had actually returned from a skiing trip in North Conway that night and had gotten a call. After they had put out the call, he had received a call from the switchboard at the fire station saying there's a big fire at the Strand Theater. And he kind of debated in whether he wanted to go or not. But he realized as he had said to me numerous times when I had talked to him in interviews, he debated and decided, well, I still have all my camera equipment packed, so I'll go see what it's going on. And he went to the theater and took basically all of the pictures that we have in the book were taken by Stanley and really documented what was going on through that. He also, as we'll probably talk about later on, narrowly escaped himself being killed as he, moments before the collapse of the roof, was on the balcony with those firefighters.
Yeah, Stanley captured some amazing images that you have in the book and on display at the Brockton Fire Museum. I want to talk a little bit more about this second alarm, though. It was so much different than what we experience nowadays. Nicole, tell us about the telephone chain system that firefighters utilized and how the telephone company and dispatch played into the incident.
So back then, once the second alarm had been struck, that would have been basically what would have happened was that the chief or the chief's aide would have gone back to the box and plugged in a phone and radioed back to dispatch that said, we need a second alarm. And at that point, that would have been telegraphed from fire alarm to the other stations. And then they would have basically started calling all off-duty fire department. It was a requirement at the time that all firefighters had a phone so that they could be called back from duty if they needed to be.
Or at least have a phone accessible to them, right?
So one of the interesting stories, we actually were able to find somebody who had witnessed the fire. Alice LaLiberte had her family rented the second floor of their home to a firefighter by the name of Alan Minahan. And so he didn't actually have the phone. The Liberté family had the phone. So they answered the call. The phone rang. She answered it. And she had to go wake him up and say, you need to report to the Strand. Well, Alice herself worked for the phone company. And so when they called her, they're like, oh, by the way, you also need to come in. So Alice's brother, Joe, drove both her and Alan to the fire scene, and she went to work and then spent the next many hours fielding phone calls about the fire from different people.
Chief, you may be able to elaborate a little more on this. Was all calling telephone operators part of the dispatching process? Obviously the telegraph system was in place to alert the fire department about initial response and everything, but how did the phone company tie into the emergency response back then?
Well, in those days it was a 2-platoon system, so you're either working or you're off duty. And you didn't have much time off in those days. So when they had a fire of any size, such as a second alarm, the second alarm would bring another engine company and another ladder company from other stations in the city to the fire. And then the dispatcher at the fire alarm office would start making phone calls to firefighters in the various stations. As firefighters came into the station to get their gear, usually the first firefighter into the station would get the list of members of that station with their phone numbers. And on the phone in the station would then start calling those members from that station. So initially, fire alarm had to make calls to get firefighters in. And then as firefighters get into the station, they would start calling people back. So those people that were off duty were called back to work, and they were expected to return to duty, and there was no extra pay for it or anything like that. It was all just part of your responsibility.
Chief, before the podcast, we were discussing all the civilians in the hot zone of the scene and their involvement in actively fighting this fire. You mentioned this sense of responsibility. It's as if everyone felt that sense of responsibility. When we look at the photos, there's just so much civilian presence and participation. It's kind of mind-blowing by today's standards. They're literally in fedoras and pea coats wrangling a hose line and helping the firefighters. It really does seem like there was like an all-for-one, one-for-all attitude with these guys. I say all this because it seems like not only was there an all call for the firefighters, but once word got out, it seems like every man in the community that could was in there trying to make a difference on this fire. It also makes me wonder how in the world there were no civilian fatalities. Nicole, you wrote that there was even a group of folks, including the mayor, inside of the theater on the stage watching firefighters actively working.
Yeah, so most of the civilians kind of had gathered on the stage and were watching the firefighters go up to the mezzanine and balcony levels.
So wait, these civilians were inside of the theater, only about 50 feet away from where the actual firefighting was taking place?
Totally different time. And today we have, scene safety officers, things like that. Back then, they didn't have any type of thing.
I just think we ought to just clarify that just a little bit, that
Sure.
those people that you're going to see in the photos in civilian clothes that are on the stage, and those people were all known to the fire department. Most of them were known as Sparks at the time. These are people that were friendly with the fire department. They followed the fire department. They supported the fire department. So these were not people that just came in off of the street. These were people that were basically at the time allowed inside the so-called fire lines. And they knew, how far they could go into a building. And there was times when they knew that they had to stay outside. But quite honestly, when you look at the pictures and see the pictures of the stage, it was probably determined at that point that things were relatively safe. But in today's society, that would never be allowed.
So we're at the point of this fire where dog bet the first in crews have to be whipped. Now, some of the folks feel like they have this fire under control, but at least a few people on scene know that they have fire inside the walls of the structure. So someone calls a second alarm. Nicole, you write that John Carroll, a captain, entered the smoke and heat-filled theater and headed to the balcony. As the smoke and fire grew with intensity, one of the chiefs struck the general alarm at 1:19 a.m. So these guys have been going hard, no respiratory protection, no rehab for roughly 40 minutes. The fire's grown exponentially since the first alarm. After the general alarm is struck, over 100 men, 5 engines, 3 ladders, and Squad A, with additional response from West Bridgewater, Abington, and Stoughton, all these men, all these places were actively providing firefighting efforts alongside Brockton FD and backfilling stations. At probably its greatest point of development, the fire has flames breaking through the roof of the Strand while firemen are still inside. Ironically, the only people going between the inside and outside seem to be the reporter and the photographer. There was truly no communication between the inside and outside divisions.
Well, you have to realize at the time there were no portable radios such as we have today. So communication at that time was people hollering at each other or sending a runner to give a piece of information or whatever. But if you back up just a little bit here, as Nicole said, when they first arrived, it was pretty apparent that the fire was in the cellar. And that was the subject of an investigation, actually where the fire started. And I think we can determine that from all accounts that we're aware of, that it did start in the cellar. But it then spread from the cellar, and it spread up the walls, and obviously the air conditioning or air ducts that were located in the walls. So the fire was rapidly extending from the basement upwards in the walls, and it was heading for the roof and the area that was above the ceiling and below the roof. We would call that today the cockloft area. And in a theater of that size, with the span from side to side requiring a large truss, that opening was easily 6 or 8 or 10 feet of space between the ceiling and the roof that could not be seen from the main theater itself. And the theater ceiling was so high that there were no tools that the firefighters could use to reach up to open that ceiling. So it would appear that the fire was extending up the walls. We see photos of the firefighters opening the walls. We see pictures of them opening the ceiling underneath the balcony. So just visualize the fire is traveling up that west wall and the south wall. And ironically, that's the area where we're going to get into now. So the fire is not only going vertical up the walls, but it's also spreading horizontally in the ceiling of the balcony. So you'll see the firefighters pulling that ceiling.
Chief, let's talk a little bit about the construction of the Strand.
Sure. So the exterior walls of the building were brick, and as Nicole said, it was a building that had been renovated. It was a prior theater. So the walls were of brick. The interior was wire lath and plaster.
Which is a firefighting nightmare.
Yeah, it is. And, in most homes of that era, the interior walls were constructed of what was called wood lath and plaster. Wood lath is thin boards that are attached to the studs, and then they put plaster over that like mud and smooth it off, and that gives you the nice interior walls. Well, in a building of this size, of a commercial building, instead of using wood, they would use wire lath. So visualize something almost like chicken wire with smaller holes. So when they put the mud on, it would adhere to that metal, and it would actually stick better than if it was wood. So in order to open up the walls to get at the fire that's traveling between the outside brick wall and the lath wall, a space of could be 6 or 8 inches, it's very time consuming to open that because the metal is unforgiving. And by the time you open a hole, the only opening you got is the hole that you made. Whereas with wood lath, when you punched a hole in the wall and pulled it, a whole big section of the wall would come out. So in this theater, that wire lath was very difficult to open. It's very time consuming, and the guys at some point were getting exhausted because of all the work they were doing. So just visualize now, well into this fire, the second alarm companies are arriving, the off-duty guys are arriving. The first alarm guys are pretty exhausted. So they had determined that the fire had got beyond the balcony area, so it was up in the second floor area. And it would appear that, unbeknownst to those people inside the theater, that the fire had extended into this so-called cockloft area between the ceiling and the roof. And I'm sure that they were concerned that the fire was in that area, but I don't think they realized how extensive the fire had reached that area. So now you take and look on the outside of the building, as you were just mentioning with Nicole. We have pictures of the fire coming out of the roof line at the top of the wall in the southwest corner, which would be behind the old police station. And there is a hose line, what we call a 2.5-inch hose line with a straight tip, and the deputy is there, and he's directing that water stream at the fire that is extending out from below the roof at the top of the wall line. That would indicate today, looking at this, that the fire really had extended into that cockloft area, and it was now showing itself at that wall line at the roof. We kind of think, in going over all this, that there was some information perhaps outside that the firefighters inside may not have been aware of. Today, if we had a similar fire, we would have radio communications. We would immediately transfer that information from inside to outside. So when you think back in those days, without that, the only way that information would get from outside inside is somebody would have to go in and give that information. And it appears as though this is really kind of a turning point in the fire.
And portable radios didn't come to Brockton until about 1973. Is that correct?
Yes, but then only for the officers.
Captain Lakacher, you probably experienced operations without radios.
Oh, yeah.
So how did you effectively communicate?
Hollering.
A lot of yelling, a lot of face-to-face.
Sure. Sign language. Pressure up, pressure down.
What other equipment wasn't provided to you guys?
When I got on the department, we had to buy our own flashlights. We had no radios. Buy our own gloves.
Man, different times. I'm glad most fire departments these days provide that kind of equipment to operations personnel. Captain Lakacher, we're going to get back to your story in episode 2 of After the Fire. But first, getting back to the Strand Theater, flames have now broken through the roof as exhausted firemen are inside. The inside division's gassed from tearing through wire lath. Nicole, you wrote that at some point, at least some of the folks on scene thought the fire was under control and they headed for home. Would you please elaborate on that point?
Yeah, I think what happened, they had a lot of smoke in the building, but as they were pulling the wire lathe down and things like that, they weren't coming up with fire. So they probably knew they had it, but they were just not coming up with it and not realizing that basically the bulk of the fire was between the ceiling and the roof. So what they were pulling down, they were just creating more smoke. So most likely that's why they're like, oh, we'll take a break. We can't pull anymore. We need a break. Some firefighters probably did decide to go home or like, oh, we're not needed because we're not on that crew.
No, I think we really should straighten that out.
Go ahead, Chief.
Nobody goes home without permission from the chief officer. I think what they were referring to is the bystanders that were watching the fire thought the fire was out and the bystanders started leaving.
Okay.
But the firefighters didn't. So I think that's a key point we got to straighten out.
Yeah, that also helps explain why there are no civilian fatalities at this fire, because most of them probably left the scene or at least left the hot zone. And I'm kind of speculating here, but that does make sense, Chief. So these firefighters are trying to catch their breath on the first balcony, oblivious to the imminent danger above their heads. And unbeknownst to them, the south wall was buckling and the roof was seconds away from collapse. Nicole?
So Stanley had heard that there was better pictures outside, so he had left the balcony where he had been with those firefighters, and he went outside. He turned to go back in, and just before he could actually, according to him, reload his camera, the roof came crashing down where he had just been. And he yelled to his assistant at the time, "My God, there are firemen under there. This is awful." And so all of a sudden they realized that basically this whole huge roof came crashing down, and where they had 13, 15 men sitting kind of rehabbing for a few minutes, now they were trying to find them.
Yeah, I'm going to quote your book here real quick, Nicole. The south wall buckled and the roof above it crashed to the ground. A bloody fireman emerged from the stage door and yelled, "There's about 20 of them trapped in there." You know, it really makes you appreciate the proper staging of rehab, situational awareness, and communications between inside and outside divisions. Chief, why do you think the roof gave way?
Well, you got to realize that when you go into a theater of that size, there are no supporting columns from sidewall to sidewall. It's a wide open view. So in order to support the roof, it requires a superstructure to hold that roof up. And that was a steel truss, a series of steel trusses that extended from the north wall to the south wall. Those trusses were, I would estimate, 5 to 6 feet wide from the top cord to the bottom cord. And those trusses sat in a pocket in the brick wall. So when they built the wall, they made a pocket for the steel to sit into. It would appear that when the fire was burning undetected above the ceiling and below the roof, that steel structure was being heated. If you read a book on building construction, the book that was written by Francis Brannigan, who was an expert on building construction relative to the fire service, he references in there that steel over a distance of 100 feet will actually expand about 9 inches. So if this steel was being heated in a confined spaces in this cockloft area, that steel being heated, using his reference, you would have to presume that steel was elongating. It was stretching from side to side. When you look at the wall where the stream is being directed from outside, in that picture, it certainly looks as though that wall is separating from the main wall. It looks like the wall is pushing out. So if you look at that wall that looks like it's being pushed out, and you consider the fact that steel, when it's heated, will expand, it will elongate, it would appear that the steel pushed part of the wall out, the steel disengaged from the pocket that it was sitting in, and the steel fell. And when the steel fell, there was no longer any support for the ceiling, and there was no support for the roof. There was some talk that the ceiling let go before the roof, but whether it came down together as a unit or 2 separate collapses, the end result was when the ceiling and roof structure collapsed, all of the weight of the roof and that ceiling and the steel all came down on top of the firefighters that were in the seats. Now, if you look at the collapse pictures, it was only the last several trusses towards the rear of the building that came down. The front part, which was over the stage and the orchestra pit, all stayed intact. So the reports that the fire was in the cellar, it was traveling the back and the southwest corner wall, puts the fire right in the area that we see from outside where they're directing that hose stream. And knowing that, I think it can reasonably presume that the fire was heating that steel. The steel expanded, the steel came out of the pocket on the wall, and the steel fell. When you look at the aftermath of the pictures, that massive steel truss is radically twisted. And that obviously was from a lot of heat. So there had to be a lot of fire above that ceiling, and a fire in a confined space in a truss-supported building is a very, very dangerous fire. And there's been numerous fires throughout the country over the years where buildings have collapsed because of truss failure. And there are also many fires where trusses have collapsed and killed firefighters. This one that we're talking about today is certainly one of the largest loss of life due to a truss collapse in a building. And from what we can gather, I think the facts that we have are pretty accurate, that the fire started in the cellar, came up the walls, came up the air ducts, lodged itself in that cockloft area, burned for quite some time, elongated the steel pushed the wall out, came out of the pocket that it sat in, and down came the ceiling and the roof.
Was there any indication to the men inside that this massive steel truss was giving way above their heads? I mean, did they see any flames or any indicators at all?
You know, when you read the reports, there was a lot of smoke in the building, and it's kind of unusual, too, that the first action of the fire department when they arrived was to put several cellar pipes in operation. A cellar pipe requires cutting a hole in the floor, and it's a device that you insert down through the floor. It sprays water in a lot of directions, and usually that is used when a firefighter cannot get into a cellar. A cellar fire is a very dangerous fire because there's no really way out. Right. You go down the stairs, and once you're down in the cellar, the only way out is the same stairs you came up. So there's no reference that I have seen of them ever getting down the cellar stairs in the early stages of the fire. So to put a cellar pipe or several in operation, it was pretty obvious to them that that fire was in the cellar. It was also generating an awful lot of smoke. So when you look at the fire conditions, the smoke conditions in the building, there's certain telltale things that you're looking for, like cracks in the wall, noises that are being made. But really, in the course of firefighting, with the noises that are around associated with firefighting, plus all the smoke, there are things that can get missed. And obviously, officers are looking for those telltale things. And in this case here, the truss that failed was hidden by the ceiling. So if it was undetected, really from within inside the theater, it isn't something that you would readily see. Now, when you think about the firefighters that were up in that southwest corner sitting in the balcony, they most likely were the first alarm companies that had been working for quite some time, and now they're being supported and relieved as firefighters are coming in off duty. That doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen instantaneously. They come in by onesies and twosies.
Right. It's not a company for company swap.
No, it really isn't. You know, when you think about accountability and who you report to and all the things that we have today to make sure that we know where everybody is on the fireground, a lot of that is not done or was not done in a formal way like we do today. So those firefighters that had been working extensively, we say were sitting, they probably were taking somewhat of a break, but we also realized that they were waiting for a hose line to be brought up into that area. So it could be that, you know, they suspected that they had some fire up there and we needed a hose line up there, and they're waiting for other companies to get enough manpower together to stretch a hose line all the way up into that balcony. That's a labor-intensive thing to do. It takes time to get a hose line up there. So it was like a whole series of events that kind of all came together, and the tragedy occurred.
You mentioned hose lines. Nicole, in your book, you pointed out that there were 14 2.5-inch lines on the ground during the fire. Granted, not all these were flowing water at the same time, but that's still a lot of water. I mean, any firefighter can attest to the fact that when you're pulling the 2.5, that's a big fire, big water situation. If you multiply that by 14, you're talking about some serious gallonage. How are the municipal water system and fire departments set up to accommodate that amount of water?
Well, first of all, a 2.5-inch line is probably the largest hand line that a firefighter is going to operate. We have an inside line, which we call 1.75 inches, which we use basically in residential fires. And a 2.5-inch line is the type of fire that would be used in a commercial operation. That hose line flows a minimum of 200 gallons per minute. If you think of the faucet on your sink, you're lucky if you get a gallon a minute, and this is flowing 200. So when you talk about 14 of these, do the math, and you can see there's a lot of water flowing at various times. To support that,
But Chief, what type of tips were they using in 1941?
most of the tips at the time were straight tips. They were either 1 inch in diameter or 1.1 inches in diameter, and they would 1 inch tip flows 200, 1.1 inches flows 250. So that's the kind of stream that would be flowing. So all of this water has to come from the water mains in the street. And the water mains in the street are the same water mains that domestic water comes from and for firefighting. And when you look at the maps that we have here, you can see Main Street has an 18-inch main, which is a pretty large main, and Montello Street has a 24-inch main. So there was plenty of water in the downtown area to support that kind of flow. So even though a lot of the side streets had 6-inch mains on them, they're all supported by very large mains.
And the firefighters were able to boost those pressures too, right?
Yeah, that's why we have pumping engines. You're going to hear of combinations in engines, which make up an engine company. And the combination is the hose wagon, basically, that lays the hose from the water supply to the fire. So in this case, the combination would drop a 2.5-inch line from the hydrant. The engine would hook up to the hydrant. And the hydrant would probably have 60 to 70 pounds of pressure in it. And the purpose of the engine is to increase the pressure to give you a proper stream coming out of the nozzle and to overcome friction loss of the water going through the hose.
Well, Chief, would you mind defining combination?
Sure. Combination is a term that came about in the fire service many years back, where the chemical wagon, which was a separate piece, and the hose wagon, which was a separate piece, were combined into one. So years ago, they had a chemical wagon, a hose wagon, and a steamer. They then combined the chemical wagon with the hose wagon and called it a combination. So it was a combination of water and hose. So now it became a two-piece company. You had the combination and you had the engine. So for this fire at the Strand Theater, the role of the combination was to stretch the hose line from the hydrant to the fire. The role of the engine was to hook up to the hydrant, attach the 2.5-inch line to the engine, and increase the pressure to give them the proper nozzle supply.
Something we've yet to discuss is the electrical trades local assisting with the rescue of trapped firefighters. There were all kinds of different organizations that helped out and stepped up, providing aid, rehab, search and rescue. Nicole, talk to us a little bit about Herbert Ferris and the electrical trades local.
So as they needed to rescue the firemen and find those who were missing, several of the local trades unions came to help, and who knew buildings. At that point, there was some fear that the building would collapse even more, so they were trying to be careful, but recover, the wounded and the missing as soon as possible. So one of the tradesmen, Herbert Ferris of the electrical trades local, who assisted, told the Brockton Enterprise later that day that, to one familiar with construction, the cause of the tragedy goes back to the days when the building was built. When it was built, no metal beds were set in to hold a steel girder with which held up the roof over the balcony. The fire worked its way up into a corner beam which supported the girder, and the flames heated to metal red hot. When water struck the hot metal, it buckled and let down the roof. Now, as Ken has mentioned from Brannigan's construction book, the steel really probably expanded. Whether it contracted when the water hit it, we don't have any proof. This was one one theory. I think the theory that Ken talked about, where it extended and pushed the walls out, is probably more feasible and more likely what would have happened.
You also wrote a profound statement that I wanted to share with our listeners. 12 women were now widows, 24 children fatherless. 19 of those children were under 21, the youngest being 6. Only 2 men had no children. And these numbers increased after the release of that statement, correct?
Right. When the 13th firefighter passed away, it became 26 children and 13 widows. Right.
When you walk out the door heading to the firehouse for your shift, and you kiss your spouse and your kids, you say, "I love you. I'll see you in the morning." That might be the last time. And that is why training and being situationally aware are so important. Everyone goes home. I want to thank each of you for participating in our first ever episode of After the Fire. Chief, please let everyone know how they can visit the awe-inspiring Brockton Fire Museum.
The Fire Museum is located at 216 North Pearl Street in Brockton. It's right off of Route 24, pretty much opposite the Good Sam Hospital. We built that building 30 years ago. It was a labor of love. We have a tremendous amount of fire memorabilia in that building, and we actually have our original 1850s hand tub that was manpower pumped, and it was in service from 1850 till it went out of service, replaced by steamers in the late 1880s.
The Protector 3.
The Protector 3, and there are not many communities that can boast that they have their original hand tub. But we have actually 2 of them. So I will let Nicole tell you how people can reach the Brockton Historical Society and the Fire Museum. All yours, Nicole.
So the Brockton Historical Society and Fire Museum are open twice a month. We are open the second Wednesday of each month from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. And we're open the 4th Sunday of each month from 2 to 4 p.m. However, we do accept special appointments. We have an email address, which is brocktonhistoricalsociety1@gmail.com. We also have a website, brocktonhistoricalsociety.inc.com, INC, that you can look for more information. We also have our, there's a Brockton Historical Society Facebook page, and there's also a Brockton Fire Museum Facebook page that you can contact and connect with us through either of those Facebook pages. The Brockton Fire Museum is usually, when you go to the Brockton Fire Museum, you will meet a former Brockton firefighter. Will actually give you your tour.
Wow, that's so cool.
And explain what you will see.
It's a special place and a wonderful opportunity to learn more about the history of our industry. And this is a 100% volunteer fire museum, folks. Nicole, if listeners out there wanted to donate to the Brockton Fire Museum, how would they go about that?
So donations, checks can be made payable to the Brockton Fire Museum and mailed to 216 North Pearl Street, Brockton, Massachusetts, 02301. Or there is an opportunity to donate online. You can go to our website, which again is Brockton Historical Society, Inc.com. That is also, you can purchase the Strand book through our website as well. And all proceeds from books that are bought through our website do go to help fund the operations of the Historical Society and the Fire Museum.
Everyone out there listening, you got to go get that book. Absolutely breathtaking photography and great stories. The 1941 Strand Theater Fire by Nicole Casper and the late James Benson. Thank you, Nicole. And with that, retired Brockton, Massachusetts Chief Kenneth Galligan will now read the names of the fallen 13 from the 1941 Strand Theater Fire of Brockton, Massachusetts.
Captain John F. Carroll, Ladder Company 3. Lieutenant Raymond A. Mitchell, Engine Company 4. Firefighter Matthew E. McGarry, Ladder Company 3. Firefighter William J. Murphy, Squad A. Firefighter Daniel C. O'Brien, Squad A. Firefighter Dennis P. Murphy, Squad A. Firefighter Roy A. McCarrigan, Squad A. Firefighter Frederick F. Kelly, Engine Company 1. Firefighter George A. Collins, Engine Company 1. Firefighter Henry E. Sullivan, Engine Company 1. Firefighter Martin E. Lipper, Engine Company 1. Firefighter John M. McNeil, Ladder Company 1. And Firefighter Bartholomew Herlihy, Ladder Company 1.
Thank you, Chief Galligan. After the Fire would like to give a special thanks to Brockton Fire Chief Kevin Galligan for showing us around town today. Thanks, Kevin. We would also like to give a special thanks to Stonehill College and Professor Scott Cohen for lending us their fabulous podcast studio, with an extra special thanks to audio engineer Jessica Williams. Jess volunteered her time today to come down and be our sound engineer. Thanks, Jess. And thank you to Nicole Casper for not only writing an amazing book that provided guidance and so much information for today's podcast, but for also securing this studio for us. Thanks for going the extra mile, Nicole. And of course, Chief Kenneth Galligan. We couldn't have done this episode without you, sir. You're a wealth of information, you're saving history, and we appreciate you for doing all that you do. Thank you. And thank you to Chief John Tippett and the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation for your support of this podcast. And listeners, don't forget to check out www.firehero.org for more information on the NFFF and what they do. Also, for all the extras we mentioned in this podcast, go to firefighterskills.com and feel free to email me, John Nelson, at info@firefighterskills.com. If you got any stories, suggestions, comments, anything you want to share, we'd love to have your participation and feedback for future episodes. And that will do it for the inaugural episode of ATF. Please check out the bonus material in episode 2, where Captain Joseph Lakacher shares his near-miss experience of being trapped in the top floor of a fully involved 2.5-story house. Some awesome pictures to go along with that too. We also delve into Chief Galligan's course on 2.5-story construction, and then explore some lessons learned from both Captain Lakacher's fire and the fire at the Strand Theater. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing your experiences with one another, and we'll see you after the fire.